Welcome back to Epilogues, an unpacking of the weekly Haftarah. You are listening to Rabbi Yaakov Trump. This week we are going to be learning together the Haftarah of Parshas Chayei Sarah. The Haftarah of this Parsha is to be found in the very first parak of Melachim, Melachim Aleph, Parak Aleph, Pasuk Aleph to Lamed Aleph. It happens to be a long parak, and we're only hearing the first half of it, but let's get a sense of what's going on. First we hear an episode which takes up the first four psukim regarding a young lady called Avishag. It describes, we're told, that David Melech Zakein, he becomes old, Baba Yamim. And in his old age, he became cold. He could not find warmth no matter what he was wearing. And his servants suggested to him that perhaps they should get an attendant, a young lady who would be his attendant, and she would lie near him so that he would be able to have some sort of heat. And that's what they do. They find this young lady, Avishag from Shunamit, and she attended to the king. The Pasukim are careful to say, "Melech lo yada'a." This was not a sexual relationship, but she was close to him. She looked after him in his old age. Now, just a few basics on this over here. Number one is, what does it mean ba bayamim? So there's a number of explanations that could mean that his days were well used. Everything would be used. They could count every day of his life, as the Igra de Kala explains, the Bnei Yissaschar. Another possibility is that he borrowed years from others, meaning to say that we know that according to tradition, David Melech was a Gilgal, reincarnation of Adam Rishon. Adam Rishon lived up to 1,000 years minus 70 years, so it was 930 years. Those 70 years he gave to David HaMelech. And so living on those borrowed years, his Baba Yamim, he was coming to the end of that tenure. His lease was coming to an end. Now, why did he lose his warmth? So there's a famous answer and a less famous answer. The famous answer, Rashi quotes, quoting a Medrash, is that when David HaMelech had the opportunity to kill Shaul HaMelech in the cave in Ein Gedi, which we learned about in Sefer Shmuel, at that point he did not kill Shaul, but in order to show that he was within reach of being able to do so, he cut the cloak of Shaul HaMelech, thereby displaying it to him to show that he was able to do it. Even that was seen as an infringement on the Malchus of Shaul, and he was punished for that in the sense that garments would not warm him. He would not be able to find that requisite warmth from his own garments. That's what Rashi says, and many of the Mefarshim follow as well. However, Rashi does quote a Medrash which says a different possibility. That's quoting the name of Rav Shmuel Bar Nachmani, who says that David Melech saw that Jerusalem would be ultimately destroyed. Nitzdanein damoy miyirasai. His blood went cold, meaning to say that David Melech was aware of the idea that he in the end of the day was going to be creating Jerusalem, which would be destroyed, and that sort of put a damper on all of his fears, and that had a psychosomatic effect on him as well. The Radak says on a more basic level, he knew that ultimately death was approaching. And as he knew death was approaching, then so to speak, he weakened. He was not able to keep his warmth. He was not able to keep his strength. This is the first section of the parak. We now hear in the next two psukim, pasuk Hey to Yud, the main essentially conspiracy, the main intrigue in our parak, which is the rise of Adoniah. Adoniah is the son of Chagit, and he says that I want to be king. So he starts gathering chariots, and he gathers horses and people running in front of him, and he starts acting in a way of kingship, and his father never really put a stop to this. He was also a very handsome-looking young man, as we're told, like Avshalom, and he was in fact Avshalom's brother, and so he gathered a few people together. He gathered Yoav ben Tzruya, Eviatar HaKohen, and Tzadok the Kohen, but Tzadok and Benyayahu were not called. Natan Navi were not called. So what does he do? He goes down to a place called Ein Rogel, which is a spring just outside Jerusalem, and he goes and he starts making a feast. Starts sacrificing, starts inviting people, but he didn't invite the main passé, the main, we'll call it, folks who were part of David HaMelech's team. So a few basic questions is, who is Adoniah? So if we go to the beginning of Shmuel Beis, we know that David Melech had a number of sons. His first born son was Amnon, who was later killed. Then there was Kilav, who sort of disappears. He's a very humble person, disappears into the recesses of history. The Gemara talks about him. Then we have his third son, is Absalom ben Maacha, who rebelled against David, trying to take the kingship as the third in line, and was killed. And then we have the Revi is Adoniah. Adoniah is the son of Chagit, so he's essentially the next in line. He's the fifth son of David, the next in line for kingship, and he's seeking this kingship as a fact that he really is next in line as well. Why is he turning to these people? So each of the people he turns to, whether it's Yoav ben Tzruya or whether it is Tzadok Kohen, these individuals were people who were I apologize, Eliasar HaKohen, not Tzadok, were people who were disenfranchised by David HaMelech. Yoav did many things which David HaMelech grew upset with. Eviatar was rejected from the Kahuna in place of Tzadok. So when it came to all of these things, David HaMelech was essentially, these are people who had already had a problem, already had something to be concerned about in the rule of David, and so he took these disenfranchised people and added them to his side. People who had reason to resent David HaMelech's rule or the natural successor of David HaMelech as well. Just a quick basic question in this section over here is, how do these two sections match up? Why do we need to hear about Avishag, which seems a medical drama of David HaMelech, and then the national drama, which is Adoniah rising to power during the life of David? Why do we need to know this? So the Malbim explains that Adoniah's pretending to the throne, his attempt to gain power, was predicated upon David HaMelech's weakness. When realizing that David HaMelech was at this stage of life and he was sort of confined to his chambers and being attended to and not really making national decisions, it was at that time of weakness, that's when people stand up and try to take power, and that's what's really going on over here. So understanding David HaMelech's condition is understanding the natural the lay of the land in which Adoniah makes his grab for power. But there's another possibility to this as well, and that's Rav Yigal Ariel writes in his book, Oz Melech, on Sefer Melachim, that really the idea over here is that David HaMelech's getting cold might have been misattributed to another reason, and that is that although it's true that his son Shlomo really is the heir apparent to the throne, but maybe his getting cold is a function of the fact that he's being punished continually for the sin of Bathsheba, for the relationship with Bathsheba, which yielded ultimately Shlomo HaMelech. And if that's the case, what Adoniah is saying is, theologically, I'm seeing a reason why this should not work out. And that might be what he's pointing to, which would give him we'll call it theological standing. And now he's going to explain that to everybody else, that God has obviously chosen me because David HaMelech is clearly, my father is clearly being rejected. If he's being rejected, therefore his son from that relationship should be rejected, and therefore I, coming from before that relationship, should be the one upon the throne. After all, I'm the next in line. So that would a lot of times we read life the way we want it to be read. So Adoniah is looking at this episode and doesn't understand that there's other things like the future Jerusalem, like David HaMelech's imminent death, like the robe of Shaul, and he interprets this coldness or his infirmness as something which credits his own name. And finally, we hear at the end. So what happens is that Nasan tells Bathsheba that this is what's happening. Adoniah is making this whole party at Ein Ragel, and he appeals to her and he says that we should go and speak to the king, and so that's what they do. They decide to go to the king, and they set up this episode. They make it seem that it was by chance that the two of them are there. So Bathsheba comes in and she comes to the king and she tells him and she says, "Didn't you swear to me that Shlomo, your son, will rule after you?" And now Adoniah is doing this whole business in Ein Ragel. He's like making this whole party. And so and she describes all the people who are left out. You know how Eviasar and Yoav were called, but Tzadok and Benayel ben Yehoyada were not called. And when you die, O king, Vayisi ani uveni Shlomo chatoim, me and my son will be chatoim, sinners, will be off the mark. While she's speaking, Nasan Navi walks in. This was how they staged it. And he explains and he says, look, he bows down and he says to the king, people are saying that long live the king Adoniah, and they're all down there and they're doing this whole business. So he substantiates her claim, and then he says, and then at the end he says, Im me'es Adoniah Melech niyeh hadavar hazeh. Then maybe we didn't know. He asks the question. Maybe we didn't know. Maybe you orchestrated this. That's what he asks of David HaMelech, and David HaMelech responds and says, no. Called to Bathsheba, and he says, he's like to explain to you. He says, Vayishavah Melech Vayomar. He makes an oath, He says, by the life of Hashem, who has guarded me from all the evils in my life. He says, Shlomo, your son, Yimloich Acharai, will rule after me, and he'll be the ruler. And she bows down and she prostrates herself and says, Vatomer Yechi Adoni Hamelech David Leolam, long live David the king. That's what is being described over here. So let's unpack this quickly over here. Just a few pieces over here is, when did David Melech actually swear that Shlomo Melech would rule after him? After Shlomo was a much later child of David Melech. Adoniah really does deserve the kingship if you're going in terms of age order. So Radak and the Chida point out that when David and Bathsheba had their first relationship, they had a child from that union, and that child died. That was part of the punishment of David and Bathsheba, was that first child died in the first week of his life. But then David Melech, she would no longer be with David after her husband had died and the child had died. She would no longer be with David unless he swore that this next child would rule, and in fact he did. And he swore that Shlomo would be this to-be son would be the king. That was where he swore, and in fact Hashem corroborated that by, he was called Yedidia, the dear one of Hashem, and Hashem corroborated that. But that was where this oath had happened as well. There's an interesting thing in the text here, in the syntax, that after Pasuk Yud Tes, or in the middle of Pasuk Yud Tes, there's a paragraph breakup, which is indicated by a pay in brackets in some versions of Tanakh, or just you'll see the paragraph break if you're looking at the correct pagination. And that could be a dramatic pause. She's in the middle of describing this whole business when she pauses for this as well. And so what does it mean that they'll be chata'im? So the Mitzuras David means, Mitzion explains that they are lacking, meaning chisaron, they'll be lacking. If we are if we are found to not be in line, then Adoniah will do, the first thing he'll do is to be deposed of us in order to gain power. But the Malbim says in a deeper sense is that if you don't let this if you let this go on, you let Adoniah be king, then essentially what you're agreeing to is the fact that our relationship was not right. You're agreeing to the fact that this was as a function of sin, that you were not atoned for by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Hashem did. And that's what Chatai means over here as well. We now ask, the basic question is, what's the connection to the parasha? Why is this of the concern of the parasha? And it seems that here we have in both the parasha in Chayei Sarah and in the Torah of David Melech, that you have an elderly father who's taking care of the future of his son during his lifetime. And what's interesting about this is that the last words of the Torah is Yechi Adoniah Melech David La'olam, that David Melech live forever, which is the basis of the song, which is David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam, that David Melech is the everlasting king of Israel. That is as a function of securing the future of his children during his lifetime. You want to know how to live forever, you want to know how to have longevity, figure out your children. Make sure that they have a path forward, that they're cared for and they're accounted for as well. One last question I'll leave with everybody to think about is, why was it that Adoniah chose Ein Rogel, this spring outside Jerusalem, as the place for his celebration of his self-coronation? And why was the David Melech chose in response the Gichon, the spring, the other spring around the corner from it? Just food for further thought. In the meantime, have a wonderful day and a meaningful Shabbos.